So today we're going to be talking about a particular form of peer review that I affectionately call the pyramid. It's loosely derived from the Bedford Style Guide. History of it's really not terribly important, but before we get into that, let's talk generally about what a peer review is. So the idea of a peer review is it's two people who are more or less on the same level reviewing a piece of work just to see if one person can see something that the person who made it cannot. In the business world, then that might be two employees who are under the same manager or who are under different managers of the same level, kind of looking over a given proposal and just making sure that it all looks all right, or two people on the same team who are going over something. In the academic world, then traditionally how we're doing this is through the form of journal publishing, in which somebody will write up an article, they will submit it to a journal, and then the journal will send that out to two or three of their readers and have them go through it and say, okay, here's where it's very strong, here are the places where it's weaker, and just figure out kind of what it's doing, how well it's doing that particular thing. If it looks like it's good enough, obviously not necessarily perfect, but if it's good enough, then it can get moved on to publication in the journal. And that's what we're going to be simulating in our class peer reviews. So the pyramid peer review, very specifically, is a hierarchy. It's not a rigid hierarchy, there's some fluidity to it, but the basic idea is you're dealing with a paper in given levels. And there are four levels actually, so level one is content, then organization, then style, and then mechanics, and that is the order of importance. The idea here is that as you're going through the paper, once you start finding that there are some problems on a given level, as long as they're relatively significant problems, then you stop there and you don't move forward. You need to fix those problems before you go back and you come at it again. And this is actually, if that looks familiar, the same way that I set up most of my rubrics for our class, because this is how I also evaluate you guys, because, well, I feel like it's extremely useful. So if you go through and you find out that, oh, well, this paper is supposed to be an argument and there's not actually an argument in it, that means there's a content level issue. And you don't have to worry about going on to organization and style and mechanics. You can go through and fix every comma that somebody has in a paragraph. But if that entire paragraph is going to get cut out of the next draft of the paper, then you just wasted your time and their time in trying to fix all of those things rather than dealing with the higher order issues first. So first up, content. Ultimately, academic writing is going to be about an argument of some sort. That can be an argument that something is happening that people might not be aware of. It can be an argument that something belongs in a given category that people didn't really think it did before, or that there's something that seems like it should be in a given category but it's not. It can be saying that A leads to B, or B will lead to C, or A will lead to C by way of B, or something like that. It can be saying that something is good or bad, or better or worse than another thing. Or it can even be telling people how to do something and how to make something work. But ultimately, it comes down to an argument. And the core of an argument is that it's going to be a claim that is supported by reasons. And those two things have to be there in order for it to work. So in any paper, on a quick scan through, you should be able to find, what is the central claim here? What are the reasons the author thinks that's true? Now, this is a class about academic writing, so of course we're going to take it a little bit further than that. We're going to have evidence that our reasons are true. And then we're going to have rebuttals that we're considering to make sure that this is the truest claim that we can possibly make. So it could be counter arguments that are, alternatives to the central claim, or it could be refutations that deal with the reasons or the evidence and say, well, actually, you gave this statistic, but that statistic's not right. It can be any number of things. And then we're going to have responses to those rebuttals to say why ultimately you are still arguing for this particular claim in spite of that, either because it's not looking at the greater good, or because they're using outdated information, or it doesn't apply in a particular circumstance that you're talking about, or whatever it is, whatever reasons that you have to believe that your claim is still true despite that contrary evidence. That's what we're looking for in the content level. And if everything there seems to be in place, if there's a lot of good information, if it all seems to be pointing to the same argument, if all the reasoning behind it is clear, then you're going to jump down to the next level, which is organization. And I'm actually going to split this in half for you guys, because there are two levels of organization. The macro level, the big picture organization, then what you're going to do is go through and make sure that every paragraph is where it should be in relationship to the other paragraphs of the paper. So up front, most papers are going to have their central claim in like one of the first couple of paragraphs until you get to, the 10 or 20 page mark. And that needs to be up front. And then underneath that, you need to have all of the subclaims. These are going to be all the reasons from that last slide that we talked about. And it should be relatively logical as to how those are ordered. Sometimes you'll have just 3 completely unrelated reasons, so you'll just have 3 distinct chunks of the paper, and that's fine. But every one of those subclaims or reasons needs to have evidence that proves that it's true. And the evidence that proves that a given reason is true needs to be near that particular reason, that particular subclaim. It doesn't do you much good to say, here's a thing, I'm going to prove it to you in 3 pages. Well, then you're not ready to bring it up when you brought it up initially. So this is the kind of stuff we're checking for with that one. And likewise with rebuttals. Rebuttals against the subclaims need to be located near those subclaims. Rebuttals against a piece of evidence need to be located near that piece of evidence. And likewise, your responses to those rebuttals need to be located by the rebuttals. So ultimately, the paper could look like central claim. Here's subclaim 1, evidence of subclaim, evidence of subclaim, evidence of subclaim, rebuttal to subclaim, response to rebuttal of subclaim. Then subclaim 2, evidence of subclaim, rebuttal to evidence, response to rebuttal, another piece of evidence back to subclaim 2. And going through with all of that stuff and just making sure that the stuff that you're putting near each other needs to be near each other, and that if you've got a hard break, you're completely done with that particular section. At the micro level, we're going to be actually looking within the paragraphs themselves. So this is standard paragraph structure. And I really like the mnemonic of the MEAL plan. That's an acronym, MEAL. M stands for main idea. This is going to be the central statement of the paragraph. This is going to be the reason that a given paragraph is trying to prove. Structurally, this should probably be the first sentence, and it's going to be the topic sentence. Then you're going to have the evidence that goes through, and you're proving that that topic sentence is true. So in some way, the piece of evidence you provide should prove that the idea you're presenting is true. Then you're going to have an analysis where you're explaining how that piece of evidence proves that that idea is true, or in what way it proves that it's true. And then you're going to take all of that and say, okay, so now that I've proved that this reason is true, here's how this connects back. It links back to the thesis statement. So you've got main idea, evidence, analysis, and links, MEAL. And in this step of the peer review, then what you're doing is you're making sure that every single paragraph of the paper follows that particular plan. There aren't any paragraphs that start with a quote from somebody else. There aren't any paragraphs that end with a quote from somebody else, because that means that the evidence is not being fully explained, or it's being explained in a non-standard order. And every once in a while, that's okay, but if you see it happening a lot, then that's going to be a bad sign. So I normally recommend following the template unless there's a really good reason not to at the organizational level. Then we're ready to move down to the next level, is style. I'm a relatively hands-off guy whenever it comes to style, simply because I want you guys to be able to find your own style. However, that doesn't change the fact that there are rules that go along with academic writing. There are specific things that you should not do, and very specific reasons that you should not do those things. So that's kind of how I look at style, is just, are you avoiding the stuff that you should avoid? Now, there are ways to develop good style. You can go through and upgrade your verb choice, or use some really fun concrete nouns. That's fine. That's the kind of Jedi mind trick stuff that gets important as you become more skilled in writing, but for our writing class, that's not going to be my central focus. I'm just making sure that you're meeting the basic requirements of academic style and then letting you find your own voice within that. So the thing that I see most commonly are first and second person pronouns. I, me, you, we, us, our. These things are all problematic because either they're drawing attention to you as the author, and normally they're being used in such a way to say, well, I think this is true, and you're trying to make a claim that you don't have evidence for, so that's just weak writing. Or they're making assumptions about the person who's reading the paper, and usually it's making an assumption that the person who's reading the paper is the target audience for the paper, which is an ideal situation. But that means that you're going to lose a whole lot of readers by making assumptions about who they are and about what they think, whenever you don't need to make that assumption at all. You can just restate the target audience rather than saying you, and then you're going to have a much clearer, more concrete paper. Going along with that, rhetorical questions are also a problem. These are the ones where you'll go through in your paper and ask a question, and then you'll find an answer. And this is probably the second most common thing that I see coming into this class. And the problem with rhetorical questions is you as a writer are really hoping that your reader is going to answer the question the way you think they're going to. Most of the time, they're not. And rather than ask a question and then provide an answer, it's much simpler just to provide that information. So you're not giving them an opportunity to see that you don't understand them as well as they think you should, or as well as you think you do. So again, rather than rhetorical question, it's easier just to make a statement. So catch any of those that you see in your partner's paper. Then there's slang. Swearing goes in this category, just improper word choice goes in there, or words that don't really exist, or at the very least are not professional. I see the word nowadays come up in papers all the time. Guys, nowadays is not really a word, so that's the kind of thing we're looking out for with this one. And then finally, unclear antecedents. Because a lot of times people are writing about a very specific object and a very specific target audience, then instead of saying the same thing over again, instead of saying young adults, young adults, young adults, young adults, young adults, or instead of referring to the same idea in 4 paragraphs in a row, then they'll start saying this. The problem is this is not clear, and it can get just as repetitive as those original things. So it's much simpler and much clearer just to find a new way to phrase whatever that thing was without saying this. Now, if this is immediately followed by the thing it's referring to, so this dog, this idea, that's fine. But if it's this and then some kind of broad nebulous term, then that's what you've got to watch out for. And then finally are the mechanics. The first part of this is MLA. It's the stuff that's easy to check. You've probably been hammered on this 1,000 times in the past. In the top right corner, header with the last name and the page number. In the top left corner, then you need author name, instructor name, class name, and then the date. It doesn't need an assignment description, doesn't need any of that nonsense, just those 4 lines. It should be the same font as everything else in the paper. That font should be professional, Times New Roman, Calibri, Arial, something like that. I don't want to see any Comic Sans, basically, is what that comes down to. And then go through and check the citations. Check that in text, you've got the author's last name and the page number where it's relevant. And on the in-text page, then you're going through with the guide in our textbook and making sure that all those citations are in place. And then for grammar, we're looking for things like commas that are being overused or underused or misused or being used to splice together sentences. Sentences that are really long and rambling and confusing, or sentences that are really short and choppy and don't necessarily have a full idea in them. Word choice, typos, misuse of words, things like that. And then it's time for comments. And the big thing that I recommend with comments is don't miss the forest for the trees. Like I said at the beginning, the beauty of the pyramid system is that you focus on giving them feedback on whatever level it is that you're working with. And you might have just read through their paper 4 different times, once for content, once for organization, once for style, and once for mechanics. But what you need to do is give them the single biggest thing that they need to work on, the thing that is making it the worst. And normally that's going to be the higher order concern. If there's one lower order concern that's really, really bad and the higher order stuff is not perfect, but it's pretty good, then you might need to focus on that lower order concern, but give them whatever the biggest thing is that they need to work on for the next draft, and then maybe a couple of other smaller things they can work on if it doesn't seem like that's going to be too taxing. And that's how we do our pyramid peer review.